just thought I would show the reassembly of this Remington 600 trigger. In a previous video I kind of went over how I correct what I believe is the major shortcoming of the Remington 700 and also 600 style Walker triggers, and that is the separate connector and trigger assembly and what I do to essentially make them one piece. I epoxy and screw the connector to the trigger, eliminating the possibility of the connector getting out of line, out of position in the trigger assembly. So I have the rear of the screw shortened and flush with the rear of the trigger, and then I also filed the front of the screw down to eliminate the slot, and you can see that it just leaves a small amount sticking out past the connector. And then I also removed the projection or the nipple on the over travel screw. This is the over travel screw. It used to have a projection similar to this. This is the trigger pull weight adjustment screw. Being that I have a screw through the connector where the over travel screw used to be, that's why you have to remove that nipple. So anyhow, I just thought I'd do a real quick video reassembly of this trigger. I start with putting the trigger back in housing. As you can see, the sear, or as Remington calls it, the safety cam, is out. At this point, this trigger housing, it just has the sear engagement screw still in place and the safety's on. There was no need to remove the safety for this. So I'm just going to use one of these little slave pins here to hold the trigger in as I start the trigger pin. Prior to this, I lightly lubricated the trigger. So I'm going to attempt to start this trigger pin. Again, a slave pin should hold the trigger in alignment. Just going to tap this in. Looks like it started well, so I can remove the slave pin. Continue to drive this through. Make sure I'm not on the safety. There, it went in pretty easy most of the way. Use a punch to set it. Now that's probably far enough. It's actually through the other side. On a Remington 700, the bolt release mechanism rides on this, so it's kind of critical that this remains sticking out a certain amount on the left-hand side. On a Remington 600, it doesn't have that bolt release mechanism, so I can go a little further with this. I think I'll call that good. So there. I have the trigger reinstalled back into housing. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in the over travel screw. The reason being the sear screw, or again, Remington calls this the safety cam. The sear screw actually sits on top of the over travel screw. So the sear screw sits in this hole. So I got to thread this over travel screw in to give the sear screw a spot to sit on. So I'm just going to put this in here for now. I'm not going to try to adjust it to where it will be until I reinstall this trigger into the rifle. But as you can see, I still have some trigger movement there. And I'll fine tune that. I'll fine tune that later. But I still, even with the elimination of that projection and unifying the connector and the trigger, I'll still have some over travel adjustment. So now that I have that screw in there, I'll go ahead and reinstall. This is the trigger weight, or the trigger spring. Oftentimes I end up putting a lighter aftermarket trigger spring in. But for now, until I install it on the rifle, I don't know what my trigger pull is going to be. I'm just going to reassemble it with the factory trigger spring. I'll reinstall the trigger pull weight spring screw. This is the screw that goes in front of the spring. So now the spring's in there, over travel screw. At this point, all there is to reinstall the sear spring. Again, it drops into this hole. There we go. And I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant right in that hole. And this drops in here. And this is going to be retained by the 2 slave pins. These little slave pins make this a lot easier to install the trigger assembly in the rifle. It can be done without them, and I've done it without them, but these sure make the job a lot nicer. So that's all there is to it. The trigger's reassembled, ready to be put back into the rifle. Hope this helps somebody out there and clarifies what I do to modify the trigger to make the sear, to make the trigger connector and the trigger one piece, as I explained in the previous video. That's all.